Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next in our Franklin in Portrait series. This is for a series of talks about Benjamin Franklin's most famous portraits based on our virtual exhibition, Franklin in Portraits, available on the Bloomberg Connects app. We continue this series with a discussion on the differences between two versions of the same portrait, Benjamin Franklin by David Martin and the copy made by Charles Willson Peale in 1785, given to the American Philosophical Society. Joining me today for this discussion is Dr. George Boudreau, cultural historian of early Anglo-America, specializing in the history of Philadelphia, the work of Benjamin Franklin, material culture, and public history. He is currently senior research associate at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and is a member of the academic advisory panel for Benjamin Franklin House. And Dr. Janine Yorimoto Boldt, art historian and cultural historian specializing in early American visual culture. She is currently the Associate Curator of American Art at the Chazen Museum of Art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome to you both.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Caitlin. And as ever, thank you to the Benjamin Franklin House, our American intellectual embassy on Craven Street. And I have not checked out the participant list. Thanks to all the old friends who are here. And particular thanks to the staff of the Franklin House, Caitlin and Eleanor Hamlin and Dr. Marcia Balasciano, who is the savior of the house and the one who keeps it going year after year. It was a delight when Caitlin and Eleanor approached me about building my interest in Franklin's visual imagery into this. And as I've said in our previous two programs, part of this has been inviting old friends to get together and chat via Zoom. I don't think I knew what Zoom was when all this started, but heaven knows the last year has pulled that together. Janine is a very new friend. We met a few years ago when she was the Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the American Philosophical Society, where they have put up a tremendous show on Benjamin Franklin, scientist. I say that sight unseen because, of course, we're still locked down, but creeping open after COVID in Philadelphia. And I look forward to getting there, I hope in the next couple weeks. It looks like museums are reopening, so we're very hopeful on that. I'm going to do a quick intro to Janine and then turn things over to her for her exciting research on this. Janine is currently the Associate Curator of American Art at the Chazen Museum of Art at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. For those of you in England who don't know the American layout, if you look at Chicago and Lake Michigan, you turn right and Wisconsin is up there. But she has certainly spent a lot of time on the East Coast. She is a holder of the 2018, excuse me, I'm off by a century there. Sorry, Janine. She took her PhD at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia in 2018. She also has a Master's of Art a Master of Arts from there in a graduate. And I have to admit, Janine, I didn't know this until this morning when I reread your CV, a BA graduate of Michigan State University, to which my family has strong affection. In addition to her work at the American Philosophical Society Museum on Benjamin Franklin, citizen scientist, you can now, is it available to order yet, Janine, the catalog?
I don't think you can order it, physical copies yet online, but you can access a free PDF version of it online at the APS website.
Well, I think Patrick Spiro and company would be angry if I didn't say everyone watching this should certainly buy a copy too, or at least send a nice donation to the APS. And in looking at your CV, Janine, I can say we're certainly of slightly different generations because your digital humanities projects list is long and very detailed. And I have never seen a CV yet of folks of my generation that have almost a page of selected blog posts. So if your CV is available online, our attenders today might be interested in taking a look at that. I will also say, and this is incredibly impressive for a scholar who is at the beginning of her career, I think it's safe to say, her list of fellowships, grants, and awards is almost an entire page long with an incredible list of accomplishments and people who funded her research at major institutions around the United States. So we'll have to meet at a conference when we get to do that in person again and hear more about this. With that, excuse me while I turn off the CV, I will turn this over to Janine. During your presentation, at the recommendation of one of last time's participants, I will go off camera so you can have everyone's undivided attention. And I'll be back after your talk. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, George, for that introduction. I will just share my screen. All right, and hopefully now everybody. All right, so I'm here today to talk about these three portraits of Benjamin Franklin, often referred to as the so-called thumb portraits, because of the prominent position of Franklin's thumb, right? Or at least my focus will be on these three, but as you'll see, there were actually many versions of this painting. The original is on the left of the screen. The middle portrait is a replica by the original artist, and the one on the right is a copy. So I will talk about how these portraits represent Franklin as a man of science and reason, and about the individual histories of these portraits, as well as speculate as to why there are multiple copies of the same portrait. So let's start with the original. So Benjamin Franklin sat for this portrait in 1767 in London. He was actually living at Craven Street at the time when he sat for this portrait. The original was commissioned by a man named Robert Alexander. Now, Robert Alexander was a Scottish wine merchant from Edinburgh who initially met Franklin when Franklin visited Scotland in 1759. According to Alexander's descendants who would inherit the portrait, in 1766, Alexander asked Franklin to look over some important papers and give him advice regarding a legal property dispute. Apparently, to commemorate their legal victory, Alexander commissioned this portrait, right? And this was written down in a note that accompanied the portrait in the 20th century. Whether or not that story is true is up for debate, but regardless, it's not strange that Alexander would want this portrait of the famous American to show off their personal relationship and connection. So in 1766, Franklin was in London as a representative of the American colonies and was testifying against the Stamp Act. However, his public fame and reputation was still very much tied to his scientific achievements. By 1766, his great publication, Experiments and Observations on Electricity, was well known and already in its third English edition. And he had already received honorary degrees from universities in England, Scotland, and America. So the artist that Alexander approached to paint the portrait was David Martin. Like Alexander, David Martin was Scottish, and they were likely brought together through a network of Scottish individuals living in London. Martin had studied with Allan Ramsay, a fellow Scottish artist also working in London. And he worked as Ramsay's chief assistant in his London studio and helped produce copies of numerous of Ramsay's portraits, including coronation portraits of King George III and Queen Charlotte. So the portrait of Franklin was actually one of Martin's early independent commissions outside of Ramsay's studio. And apparently Martin himself was quite pleased with the portrait because he submitted the portrait, presumably with Alexander's blessing, to the annual Society of Artists exhibition in 1767 held at Spring Gardens. The portrait was included as Portrait of Dr. Franklin, as you can see here on the screen. So Franklin's name was included at a time when most portrait subjects were generally not named in exhibition catalogs unless they were prominent or famous individuals. Horace Walpole attended this exhibition and singled out Martin's portrait of Franklin, calling it a quote-unquote good likeness. Benjamin Franklin liked the portrait so much that he had Martin paint him a copy to send to his family back in Philadelphia. So what you're looking at now is the copy that's now in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, or PAFA. The fact that Franklin commissioned a personal copy of this portrait to hang in his home indicates that this is how he saw himself, or perhaps how he ideally wanted to be seen by others who might visit his home. Right, and this isn't, of course, the first portrait that Franklin sat for. Right, the smaller, simpler portrait by Benjamin Wilson, which you're seeing on the screen on the left, had already been painted with the intention to hang in his Philadelphia house. And there were a couple of other portraits that others had commissioned of Franklin as well, including this portrait by Mason Chamberlain on the right. So So this portrait was commissioned by a Virginian living in London named Philip Ludwell. And it was done just, only about 5 years before the Martin portrait was done. William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's son, actually commissioned a copy of this portrait by Chamberlain for himself. And we also know that Franklin ordered Mezzotint copies of this portrait by Chamberlain to send to his family and friends as gifts. So he did like this portrait immensely. However, if we look at this portrait by Chamberlain, it really focuses heavily on Franklin's experiments, right? You can see lightning striking in the distance, and they're striking lightning rods attached to the buildings. And he's busy looking at the bell, which would have been attached to lightning rods within his household. And the cork ball experiment, which is right in front of it. And so that's another experiment that he did at home. So the portrait is referencing some very specific inventions and experiments that Franklin performed and wrote about. It also shows him seated in a very plain dress, right? Just a simple brown suit. And so this is an image that Franklin circulated widely. And Franklin was very attuned to his public image and used this portrait in his public image very strategically, right? So this is how he wanted a lot of friends and family to see him, right? He wanted people to see him as a man of science, but one in more modest clothing and without more elite pretensions. But it was this portrait that Franklin would have paid quite a lot of money to have a full-size replica of for his home in Philadelphia. And unlike the Chamberlain portrait, this is a less modest image of a man of science, one that emphasizes intellect and wealth almost as much as it emphasizes his intellectual work. Franklin wears a fashionable blue suit made of either velvet or fine wool and with gold details. He's also wearing a wig associated with professional men of learning, including physicians. So the specifics of the wig and clothing may be hard for us to understand today, but in the 1760s, such sartorial displays would have been immediately legible to viewers as signs that he was a well-to-do man of the professional and commercial classes, a prosperous man, but not an aristocratic one. His pose, with his thumb very prominently placed on his chin, clearly conveys that he is thinking. And this is not a pose that comes very naturally. If you try to recreate it at home, posing just your thumb in this way with the index finger out and the other finger sort of gently curving inward, it takes some self-awareness and control to hold that pose. The pose therefore suggests that Franklin's alert and concentrating hard on what he is reading. And it's a rather unique pose. So family and friends actually remembered Franklin holding his chin up with his thumb, just like this, while he was reading to help keep his spectacles in focus. And so the artist is therefore capturing Franklin in a pose that was very distinctly his. In many ways, the portrait represents this quintessential man of the Enlightenment. The light in the painting very equally illuminates his hand as well as his forehead. And you can see how very carefully David Martin painted his hand with the various textures and vein structures visible. The lighting therefore also emphasizes Franklin's intellectualism and reasoning, as well as his hands-on approach to science. So Franklin was an active man of science, not an armchair philosopher. Right? He designed and engaged in experimentation and had made a living with his hands as a printer. And he had a lifelong respect for manual labor and the working classes because of this background. The equal attention paid to his head and his hand in the painting is significant and speaks to Franklin's approach to science or natural philosophy. Right? Franklin's also engaged in the act of reading. And what exactly is he reading? Right? Scientific papers, a political treatise? It's sort of unclear. According to descendants of Robert Alexander, he's reading the property deed, a reference to the property dispute that Franklin assisted the Alexander family with. However, the writing is supposed to be visible on the documents, right, which is laying on the table, but the writing itself is actually vague and totally illegible, right? So it allows the viewer to imagine what Franklin is reading. He could be reading anything. More papers and books are stacked on the table, covered in red velvet, but these books also do not have titles. So all of this sort of allows the viewer to imagine what books he might be reading. Franklin's also being watched over by a bust of Sir Isaac Newton, connecting Franklin to a distinguished line of English natural philosophers. And of course, Newton was an extremely important natural philosopher who Franklin greatly admired and who influenced Franklin's own approach to science. And so the choice of including Newton in the Franklin portrait is significant and very intentional. And in his own lifetime, people often compared Franklin to Newton. However, I will point out that including a bust of a historical figure whom one admired was not an unusual device in portraiture. And Martin painted other portraits that also include portrait busts, such as his portrait of Lord Mansfield. So Martin was actually drawing on an established visual language of representing men of science or genius in portraiture. So it was common to see men seated with books and papers as if they were at work. And so here's an example of his role model, Sir Isaac Newton, as well as a contemporary portrait of the artist Sir Joshua Reynolds. So in Reynolds' portrait, a bust of the artist Michelangelo is included, right? In much the same manner as the bust of Newton is featured in Franklin's portrait. Reynolds also has his head in his hand in a pose of contemplation, right? So Franklin's thumb pose is an echo of this popular pose, which signified reasoning and thinking. However, in both of these portraits that you're looking at of Newton and Reynolds, the subject is looking out at the audience as if interrupted in their work. Franklin shows him engaged in work with his focus on the papers in his hands instead of on the viewer, which is actually a bit unusual. So Martin's portrait of Franklin was both unique and part of a genre of portraiture representing men of learning. There are also very few and very subtle original painting that Martin painted for Alexander and the replica that Martin painted for Franklin himself. So the most obvious one is the chair. The original features an ornamental crest with an eagle right at the center, right? Or did it? Okay, so it's actually unclear the eagle and crest was in the original painting. In 1766 or 67, when the portrait was painted, the eagle wasn't yet firmly associated with America. So including an eagle would not necessarily be an obvious choice for a Franklin portrait. Most of the copies and replicas also do not include the elaborate crest, which raises the question, was it in the original painting? In 1814, Martin's original portrait, the one on the left, was exhibited in Philadelphia, and it was apparently repaired by the painter Thomas Birch. So it's possible that Birch added the crest rail ornamentation man of high office. It's also possible that there was already a crest and that Birch added an eagle at that time, right? So that's one theory about the portrait. However, there's actually yet another copy of the portrait that dates between 1775 and 1785 that was also likely painted by Martin himself. And that does include an ornamental crest on the chair. So I couldn't find a usable photograph of this version of the portrait, unfortunately. But this version of the portrait, which also has different coloring and different facial expression, is evidence that the original portrait by Martin did in fact have an elaborate crest on the chair. So at this point, like maybe you're wondering, why does it even matter that much? Why am I spending so much time talking about the chair? Well, if the ornamental crest did appear in the original, then it would be significant that Franklin's personal copy that he ordered for his own house and is seen here on the right, it matters because it had more modest furniture, and thus it tones down the display of wealth from the original portrait. So the likelihood would be that Franklin requested that the chair be simplified, right? And that would speak to Franklin's personal taste and his desire to appear more humble, which tells us about how Franklin wanted to be portrayed, right? He wanted to be seen as a slightly more humble American man of science rather than seated in this really elaborate chair, right? And often elaborate chairs are associated with royalty and nobility and men of high office. Another very subtle difference is the sleeve on Franklin's proper right arm, so the one that's propping up his chin. The cuff falls slightly lower and more of the white shirt beneath is visible in Franklin's Philadelphia copy. So this draws more attention to the hand because the sleeve is lighter in color and it brings your eye to that part of the painting. And again, finally, the other difference is actually in the wig. So the original shows a short queue or a ponytail that's actually missing in the Franklin version of the portrait. which again just sort of softens the sort of pretension of the portrait. So what happened to these portraits? Well, the original portrait commissioned by Robert Alexander descended to William Alexander, his brother, because Robert had no children. And from William Alexander, the portrait descended to his daughter, Marianne, and her husband, who happened to be Jonathan Williams, one of Franklin's grandnephews and proteges. Williams was very close to Franklin. Jonathan Williams and Marianne married in Europe before moving to Philadelphia in 1785, and they brought the original portrait with them. It then descended in their family for several generations, and now is in the White House collection. And on the left, here's a photograph of it in the White House as it was decorated by the Kennedys shortly after the portrait was given to the White House collection. And from what I can tell, I believe it was actually the first major art acquisition by Jackie Kennedy when she was First Lady. And on the right is a photograph of it during the Nixon presidency. And so for a long time, it was hanging in the green room of the White House. Further, another branch of the Alexander family that descended from William Alexander and also immigrated to the United States ended up with yet another copy of the portrait. Again, I don't have the photograph of this copy, which I believe is still in a private collection. But Franklin's friend John Sargent, an English merchant, banker, and member of parliament, acquired a copy of the portrait from Martin himself. Right? And so Alexander descendants later ended up with this copy that Sargent had ordered. So if you're keeping track, we've now talked about the original portrait painted by Robert Alexander by David Martin. A contemporary copy, also by David Martin, with the chair crest, but with slightly different coloring. A copy of David Martin for Benjamin Franklin himself by the original artist. And then a fourth copy, also by Martin, painted for Franklin's friend, John Sargent. And those last two, the one for Franklin and the one for Sargent, do not have the chair crest. Now, Benjamin Franklin sent his copy to Philadelphia around 1771. He remained in London, but he sent it to his wife, Deborah. And in Franklin's will, he later bequeathed the portrait to the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania to hang in their chamber. However, the council was short-lived as the state restructured its government, and the portrait had nowhere to go. So it hung for a time at the museum run by artist Charles Willson Peale in Philadelphia before it was sold after the museum closed. And then later owners would donate it to PAFA. Now, Charles Willson Peale, the artist, managed to make a copy of the portrait in 1771 or 1772 when he borrowed Franklin's version. So Peale was an artist working in Philadelphia in 1771, and he had previously met Franklin in London while Peale was studying with the artist Benjamin West. So the Martin portrait was likely sent to Deborah rolled up. So this was the most common method of shipping paintings from Europe and England to America. When it arrived in Philadelphia, it would need to be unrolled, inspected for damage, and framed, and then put on stretchers. So the most likely scenario is that Deborah asked the artist Charles Willson Peale to unroll and frame the portrait, and Peale probably asked to copy it while he had it in his possession. And as we'll see, Peale adhered very, very closely to the Martin portrait that he copied. So Martin's version is on the left, and Peale's version is on the right. And any differences between the two are so slight as to be barely noticeable. Right? It's unclear exactly why Peale made this copy for himself, but he did hang it up in his painting rooms. So he probably assumed that copying this portrait would be a good painting exercise, because he was still fairly early in his career, but it would also show off his connections to Franklin and advertise his skill to attract new patrons. And we know that people did see this portrait in his painting rooms. In 1785, Peale gifted the portrait to the American Philosophical Society. The American Philosophical Society, or the APS, had been founded in Philadelphia by Franklin in 1743. It was an elected member society whose structure was largely based on the Royal Society of London. Franklin served as the APS president in the 1780s, right? So it makes sense that Peale would offer them a portrait. Peale was also probably campaigning a little bit for his own membership and hoping to be elected. And he soon would be elected a member of the APS, both for his skill as a painter, but also his work as a naturalist. However, in 1785, the APS did not yet have a permanent structure or anywhere to permanently hang or store the painting. So they accepted the painting, but asked Peale to hold on to it for a little while. The APS began building a structure in 1789, just behind Independence Hall. In 1791, the APS officially accepted Peale's portrait of Dr. Franklin, and it has remained in their collection ever since. For many years, the portrait hung in Philosophical Hall, the building you're seeing here, which was the home of the APS. It presided over all of their regular meetings. And today, this building continues to hold the APS offices and now the APS Museum, where annual exhibitions are held. As the APS grew, however, the regular meetings and large events had to be moved into a larger building, and they moved it into a building now called Franklin Hall, just across the street. The Franklin portrait was moved to this building so that the portrait could continue to preside over all APS meetings. And here's an image from a recent meeting during the induction of new elected members. And you can see the Franklin portrait hanging in the center of the room, overlooking the meeting. And it is now flanked by by portraits of members Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, who also belonged to the APS. So Martin's portrait of Benjamin Franklin was quite influential in the late 18th century and remains so today. In the 1780s, the artist Benjamin West actually made 2 copies of the Martin portrait. So here's here's 2 more, early copies of the painting. Closely, it's missing all the gold details on the coat, so he toned down the coat quite a bit. West probably painted these portraits when he was searching out life portraits of Franklin in preparation for a history painting. And then it was actually Benjamin West's version of the portrait that was published as a mezzotint by Edward Savage in 1793. And so this portrait circulated widely. And so it brought the thumb portrait to in the 19th century, an artist named James Reed Lambden painted a copy of the original Martin portrait, the one that was sold that portrait to the Library Company of Philadelphia. And so the Library Company was another Philadelphia institution founded by Franklin. The Franklin Fire Insurance Company of Philadelphia, another institution with roots with Franklin, also purchased a 19th century copy of the portrait. So their copy was copied from the version painted by Charles Willson Peale and owned by the American Philosophical Society. So a copy of a copy. So can you keep track of all of these copies? The various versions of this thumb portrait have been reproduced many, many times, right? It's been used as the cover of countless books, and here's just a selection. And it appears on event posters and ads, especially in Philadelphia. It was used on tavern signs, it's been on postal stamps, and recently it was used as a promotional image for the exhibition I curated at the APS. So it continues to be circulated very widely. The portrait, I think especially the APS version painted by Peale, also directly influenced other American portraits. For example, the artist Gilbert Stewart painted Thomas Jefferson in 1822 in a portrait that very closely mimics a Franklin portrait. The portrait was painted, the portrait of Jefferson was painted as a part of a series of the first 5 presidents. So my understanding is that the original portrait was destroyed in a fire, but the painting was reproduced as a print in 1828 for a publication called The American Kings. And that print is what we are looking at. So at least it gives us an idea of what the painting looked like. Both Franklin and Jefferson sit at a table covered high with books and papers and with a curtain on the left side of the painting. However, a bust of Benjamin Franklin replaces that of Newton, right? So Jefferson was a champion of American science. seeking to prove that America could produce scientists and scholarship as worthy as those from Europe. The replacement of Newton, an icon of English science, with Franklin, an icon of American science, was therefore a very calculated choice. Franklin was the ultimate American man of science, but also a recognized civic leader. And the Jefferson Portrait references Franklin because Jefferson, like Franklin before him, was very interested in joining the pursuit of science with political leadership. Notably, Jefferson had also been president of the APS from 1794 to 1814, a term that overlapped with his US presidency. So Jefferson would therefore have been very familiar with the Peale version of the thumb portrait that hung at the APS, and he may have seen one or more of the other versions of it because, of course, it was displayed multiple times. Though Jefferson was not directly involved in this commission by Stewart, it's hard not to draw a direct connection between the two portraits, and surely Stewart was basing his portrait of Jefferson off of either one of the oil portraits or possibly one of the circulating prints. Much later, in 1999, the mathematician and computer scientist Herman Goldstein was painted by John R. Friedman and appears to be seated in Franklin Hall in front of the Franklin oil portrait. Both the subject and the artist were APS members. The portrait mimics the Franklin portrait's composition. Instead of sitting at a table with papers and books, however, Goldstein sits at a table decorated with the APS seal, with a gavel and percussion piece, and with the ENIAC, which is the electronic numerical integrator and computer, right? The first digital computer, which Goldstein had helped develop. So Goldstein's written notes are also incised on the wooden frame that hangs around the portrait. The scientific data is therefore presented in traditional written form, as it was in Franklin's day, and in contemporary form with the computer. Rather than the Newton bust, the Peale portrait of Franklin hangs over his shoulder. So Goldstein's portrait shows the evolution of scientific practice at the APS from Franklin to Goldstein. So these images of Dr. Franklin have had an enduring influence in American art and culture. And I can only speculate about why exactly this particular portrait was so popular and has remained so. To me, it seems to capture Franklin as he very much wanted to be remembered, and as we often remember him today, as a pensive philosopher, right? Always thinking, always reading and writing, always with something intelligent to say, but also a bit aloof, unreadable, as he does not look out at the viewer, and we cannot read his papers. So the portrait allows us to imagine Franklin engaging in any number of activities, politics, science, philosophy, because it doesn't firmly tell us what it is that he's reading or working on. So viewers can see what they want to see in this portrait of Franklin. And many of Franklin's writings and thoughts on subjects are similarly unclear, right? So for example, it's hard to tell how he truly felt about slavery and abolition. We can read all of his papers and still never quite be 100% sure that we understand who Franklin the man was. And I think that that is one of the reasons that this portrait has continued to capture our attention and continues to represent who Franklin was to Americans who look at it. So I will stop there. And then I'm looking forward to discussion with George.
Thank you, Janine. That was phenomenal. And I'm under orders from one of our participants to not include my ceiling fan in my presentation. So I'm trying to adjust my camera accordingly. That was great. And it's always been a painting that fascinated me. And for those of us, last time I asked if those of you who are not in Philadelphia, and we had a nice sprinkling of people around the world, would let us know where they're joining the program from. The picture, or the portrait has always made me think that this is the Franklin of Craven Street, that if we could see him going out of the famous brown front door to walk up towards the Strand, etc., that this would be the man you might have encountered wearing the Physic periwig wearing this incredibly elaborate jacket, which according to the portraiture of the time would not have been unusual in London's West End during this time. I find it fascinating. I'd never noticed the connection to Benjamin West in his copies, and the fact that West was, as Carol Soltis told us in the last program, always fiddling with Quakerism, although he was not a birthright friend. His father was, but he wasn't. And he was always playing with Quaker imagery. So I think the fact that he stripped Ben Franklin of his gold braid and buttons was pretty fascinating. That since Franklin, of course, was no Quaker either. But this is a fascinating talk, and again, it seems to be the most reproduced of the life portraits. I can't think of anything else that would come close. And that he was having this copied and I wonder, did Americans see him in this picture? I've given a lot of lectures on Franklin and portraiture, and this always seems to be the painting that most surprises the viewers, because they don't think of him in a wig, and they don't think of him in such sumptuous surroundings. You as an art historian do much better with that chair than I've ever been able to do. And I don't know, it would be, I wish we could go into discussion at this point with the whole group to ask how many of us have actually seen the painting live. I have to admit, I'd only seen it once before very recently, and that was on a child's tour of the White House, where for decades it hung over the green room's fireplace. It was slated, as the story goes, for the Philadelphia Museum of Art as part of the Edinburgh collection. And when Jack Kennedy was elected president in 1960, and Mrs. Kennedy made it her life's work to restore and not redecorate, she was careful to say, the White House, she went on an art hunting mission and went to Ambassador Walter Annenberg. And I'm not going to do my Jackie Kennedy impersonation. That might get us thrown out of London or something, but allegedly said to him she wanted the most famous Philadelphian of her time to give a portrait of the most famous Philadelphian of all times. And Walter Annenberg, I guess, was an easy touch. So so the portrait hangs at the White House, or at least hung there until Trump didn't care for it. So swapped it out for close to it. Have you been down to see it at the National Gallery? It was quite a shock. I was there to see Kate LeMay's show called Votes for Women, and always pop up to the Early America Gallery to see who out of their fabulous collection is hanging. And there it was. And I got yelled at by the security guard because after teaching this painting for 30 years, I was able to get my nose right up against it without my glasses to really get into the brush strokes and the detail. And I was told I didn't know how to behave in a museum to please get my nose.
I get yelled at all the time in art museums. If the APS exhibition is able to Peale version, and unfortunately, I don't think the PAFA version is currently on display, or at least it wasn't when I was in Philadelphia. But it is remarkable that I think scholars of Franklin are very familiar with this portrait, but the wider public maybe is less so, and maybe partly because of where these copies are kept, but also because it didn't circulate quite as widely as some of the other ones. And I think the point about the simplified versions of the Franklin, right, the Duplessis version, the Mason Chamberlain version that circulated very widely in print form, they all show a simpler man of science. And I think Franklin knew that, and that's one of the reasons he never reproduced this portrait. I think this was how he liked to see himself. It's how he wanted to commemorate this portrait. He wanted it in a government building eventually. But I do think it's sort of interesting that this is not one that he widely reproduced, right? That this is not necessarily how he wanted fellow Americans to see himself widely, because this is more of a sort of elite, pretentious portrait, which is great. So yeah, I think the part about Benjamin West stripping him down a little bit, because West, of course, was invested in painting Franklin as this modest American, Quaker, which is the image that most Americans still have of Franklin. Not the Quaker part, but like the modest sort of origin of Franklin. And this portrait isn't quite that, but it is still sort of in the middle. And I love the fact that the Franklin version was sort of a stripped down version, right? Like I'll wear the fancy coat and the wig, but maybe soften the wig and like remove the ornamentation so your eye isn't quite drawn to the chair, right? So slightly more modest and appropriate for Philadelphia.
We spend so much time trying to get into their brains, well, all these people, and I've spent years myself as a scholar trying to get into the relationship of Deborah and Benjamin Franklin. And I wondered during your talk, so much of the correspondence between Franklin and the women folk who had refused to come to Craven Street with him is he's constantly sending stuff. And Mrs. Stevenson was his kind of personal shopper. So she's going out and buying dishes and clothes for the wife back in Philadelphia. But I wonder, as he's telling Sally, no, I'm not going to send you lace. You can, wear your old clothes till the moths eat them and then it'll look like lace. Or telling Deborah she didn't need more china, although they appear from Paige Talbot's pivotal work on this, that they seem to have sure had a lot of dishes. And I wonder how much of this is he didn't want an expectation that I'm coming home with furniture like this. Although he certainly, after Deborah died, when he came home, he brought furniture, and I've often wondered what on earth, what must that trip back have been like, crammed full of all this stuff he bought for years in London and then later in Paris.
Right. Yeah, so Frank, the ultimate, like, do as I say, not as I do, right? But there's just a little bit of correspondence about this portrait where he asked her to hang it. I think it's like above the stairs. So he calls it the great picture, as opposed to the smaller one that would have hung with the portrait of Deborah together. So he is still trying to direct sort of where it goes in the house, although that letter is, I think, mostly ripped, so it's hard to read the whole thing. But their exchange too of portraits is really interesting because he was bringing portraits of Deborah and his children to London to have them copied, and then he sends back his portraits. And so they're engaging in building sort of relationships through portraiture here, and he's interested in maintaining a relationship with them, and he has a piece of them even when he's in London through their portraits.
The London house, I forgot to ask, have you been to the Franklin House in London?
I have not. I would love to go. When I was in London, I didn't make it. It's on my list.
It's interpreted unfurnished. Although every time I'm there, I start wanting to lay out furniture as an old museum site director. And I've wondered where the family portraits hung. Were they up in his bedroom or in the parlor that they interpret? But we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. There's, of all the letters he wrote, he never wrote one explaining exactly where he was hanging them in London. As
Caitlin alluded earlier, I've always tried to volunteer a lecture whenever I'm in London at the house, and we often will go with a staff gathering around the corner to the Ship and Shovel pub, which I keep joking that one of these days we'll get to do a live program again. So, Janine, we owe you a drink at the Ship and Shovel when next we're allowed to cross the border.
Yeah, that would be great. I hope to make it back to London soon.
I realize as I pivoted my camera today so you don't have to get nauseous looking at my ceiling fan, I've got my own little Ben Franklin shrine sitting behind me. I feel very David Martin-esque.
Perfect, yeah.
I know we have some APS staff on the call, as well as you being the big white bust was a gift when I was a graduate student from Roy Goodman, whose wife Sherry Buffano had found the mold at a junk sale and made plaster casts for Franklinists. And it seems to be holding up right now, the flag that I waved at Barack Obama's inauguration. So my little shrine to Americanism is behind me. I know we have one question. Let me see if I can open this with my dreadful vision. And if not, maybe young Caitlin. And unfortunately, I can't see the person who asked it when I open it. I'm sorry. Mary Grace Wall writes, the APS exhibition is planning on opening in limited capacity on August 5. Please visit the website for upcoming details, which is amphilsoc.org.
That's great. Yeah,
so
that's great. It's the first time I'm hearing it.
Yeah, we can't get in yet. It sounds like Mary Grace. And Mary Grace, you are indeed the curator there now, are you not? Have I got that wrong?
Mary Grace is the Associate Director of Exhibitions and Collections at the APS. And so, so the exhibition she's mentioning, so I curated last year. It's supposed to open in 2020. It was delayed. You can now visit it online. And now you'll be able to visit it in August in person if you're in Philadelphia. There is, I curated an exhibition called Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist, which looks at Franklin as a man of science, but also explores the ways science in the 18th century participated and created inequality. And so the thumb portrait by Charles Willson Peale after David Martin is one of the very first objects that you'll see when you walk into that gallery. So you'll be able to get up nice and close to the magnificent portrait. Usually that version hangs very high up on the wall in the APS meeting rooms. You can't actually get close to it. So it's exciting to be able to borrow it and put it back in Philosophical Hall, where it originally hung for so many years.
Did you ask the White House if you could borrow the original, or did you? We were unable to get anyone there to respond to us as we were putting this program together, so we're still not.
Oh.
There's someone must be in charge, but I know that the former administration had staffing issues in those last months, and as well as other issues that we won't talk about this morning.
No, we did not look at borrowing that version because we already had the Great Peale version. So we did not look into getting that, but we included a number of other smaller Franklin portraits to talk about how his face is so widely reproduced. And we're told the APS version has nice glazing on it, so you can get pretty close. You won't damage the painting if you look too closely.
I'll try not to press my nose against it, but Mary Grace, I'm not promising anything. So it's one of the problems of working with and around museums. You do tend to get a little familiar with the objects, and I've been asked to not take things off the wall, for example. So it's.
Yeah.
Have we more questions or more points for discussion? We have plenty of time left. I find it fascinating. I'll keep rambling on that this is so widely reproduced, and the one that he copies, because it shows Franklin, I think both at his most English. It's very much a British piece of art. And that was also a sign of his success in the empire at that moment, but his failure in Philadelphia. He had, of course, lost his bid for re-election. He was the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, elected when Isaac Norris retired or resigned. And Norris is most famous for being the one who chose the inscription for the Liberty Bell, for those of you in England who probably have never heard of him before. And then Franklin is booted end of the year in a coalition of Penn family supporters. Thomas Penn was the chief proprietor, and Germans who Franklin had insulted decades earlier by calling them Palatine Boers. So essentially, in Philadelphia County, where I'm sitting right now, Franklin lost the German vote, primarily centered in what is now North Philadelphia, and the area that's now part of the city. It was then a separate village called Germantown. So we can look at him at the end of 1764 when he leaves for London for what was his third trip, and the trip that was to last until the 70s, as kind of as a moment of failure. He is, by all calculations at this point, an old man.
Rioters attacked or threatened to attack the Philadelphia home, and Deborah had to rally and protect the home. So yeah, he was not the most popular in America, but he was still quite popular in England. And so yeah, that's one of the reasons I've always been fascinated by this portrait, because he sat for countless portraits. I mean, I don't know if anyone was more reproduced in the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, right, than Benjamin Franklin. And yet he owned very few portraits. I think he only owned 2, maybe 3, and this is one of them. This is the grandest one And so it is pretty significant that he liked this portrait so much and saw himself in its portrait.
I think you just paraphrased a book that I pulled last night, Charles Coleman Sellers' classic Benjamin Franklin in Portraiture. But Sellers said he made exactly that observation almost a half century ago, that no commoner in the 18th century was painted more than he was. No. And I almost look at this and wonder, was it a little bit of revenge? These folks who had tossed him from office, he was showing, look at how successful I am and look where I am now. He's in the center of the empire. He's meeting with the biggest names in the world intellect. He's meeting with leaders of parliament. He's the one who's called in to put down the Stamp Act crisis, explaining to them, Americans will simply stop buying the junk you're sending over. We'll make this a point of pride, which I don't think parliamentarians had really considered up to that point. Non-importation wasn't a thing at that, but this helped make it so. So he's, it's sort of his way of thumbing his nose with that famous thumb at the folks who defeated him from office and gotten him thrown out of the colony.
That's true, although I always wonder how many people he expected to see it once it arrived in Philadelphia, because it went straight to his home where mostly his friends and allies would have been visiting at the time, since just Deborah and Sally were living there, rather than political enemies. Although, of course, then it ended up in Peale's painting room, so more people would have seen it. And there's no correspondence between Peale and Franklin, so we don't know if that was coordinated or not. And so I think that's significant, although perhaps that is why he left it to the government, right? Like, I'm going to leave this grand portrait of myself for the state government, the state council, which is great.
Portraits are political things. It's you have to. I mean, it's Margareta Lovell, my good friend and collaborator on projects, wrote in her masterful book on Anglo-American portraits. It's the most valuable thing anybody bought. The minute it was done was essentially intrinsically worthless. You could buy a silver teapot, and if you needed to, you could melt down the silver teapot and make it into coins. But what do you do with a used portrait? And that's
exactly
why we have these cringeworthy stories of people who, portraits that we now consider very precious, being found in an antique store in 1910, for $20 or something.
Right. So we do have 2 questions that came in.
Oh, good. Sorry, I didn't.
No, it's okay. I just make sure we answer them.
You probably, with your better vision, you probably could read them better than I. Mary Grace asked, do you have a version that you like the best? You'd better be careful on this, Janine. You might want to say the one in her collection. And is there a reason you like one over the other?
I mean, I have to say the APS version by Charles Willson Peale, because I spent so much time working with it and looking at it, and so much time at the APS. And I also think Charles Willson Peale is such an amazing person to study, such a character. And I think Carrie Diethorn, is talking about Charles Willson Peale soon as part of the series. So you'll learn more about Charles Willson Peale, but he was such a fascinating person. And so I have to say I have a personal attachment to the APS version for those reasons. But they're all so similar, right? You could pick any of them almost.
Maybe APS should do a show in which they hang all of them together, the way the Gilbert Stewart show some years ago just had an entire room full of Stewart's Washingtons. That was, when you saw them all together, it was almost a bit much.
Yeah, just like 12 or 13 thumb portraits of Franklin.
I guess so. It would be funny to get them all in a room together and see what we could see from that. But
yeah.
And then anonymous attendee, I never knew you could do this, asks, what was the framing tradition at the time the portrait was painted? Very elaborate, very simple. Did the frame carry any significance? Anonymous attendee, if you want to identify yourself, we'll footnote you for the and Benjamin Franklin House would like to answer this question live.
Yes. Yeah, well, I'll do my best to answer it. I know a little bit less about the British framing tradition, although the original frames I've seen on portraits like these were generally fairly grand and often gilt, but I haven't seen the original frame, so I don't know exactly which of these versions still have original framing. But these large-scale, elaborate portraits often had sort of carved, gilded frames. So that was very common in England. In America and the colonies, there were sort of two different ways you could frame a portrait. One was to do the gilded version, the carved, elaborate gilded version, which was semi-common, especially among the wealthy families, and especially like in the northern areas of Philadelphia and Boston. But there was also a tradition of very simple, plain frames with very little decoration. And so depending on what you chose, it actually makes the portrait look quite different, right? Because if you have an elaborately carved portrait, it draws even more attention to it. Whereas if you have a very simple portrait, it's much more modest. The APS version, when the APS finally acquired it in like, I think I said 1791, there's a note in the records where they set a dollar amount. They said, we want as nice of a frame as you can make for this amount of money. And so that's the frame that it still lives in today. And it's an elaborate gilded frame with some carving. But of course, by that time, Franklin had passed away. He was this exalted figure. So they would have wanted to honor him and draw attention to that portrait within a really elaborate frame. So I don't know what it looked like. I don't know what the original frame that Franklin had looked like. That would be telling, right? Whether or not it was simple or elaborate. Unfortunately, I don't know. It doesn't survive. But for whatever reason, it needed to be replaced. So it either had been damaged or it was a very simple frame, which if it was Franklin's original frame and he had wanted a simpler frame, that sort of says something again about modest furnishings and not wanting to make it an even more elaborate portrait. And if it was very simple, perhaps APS said, forget that one, we want to give him an ornate frame.
I'm trying to run through in my head the tradition in Philadelphia of who was in an elaborate carved Rococo frame. I'm thinking of the one around Angelica Kaufman's portrait of Samuel Powell, for example, the original of which is not in Philadelphia. And there were others, and I'm trying to remember Peale's Cadwallader family and what they were framed in. But I don't know, was really elaborate, these incredible frames you see in the National Portrait Gallery in London, were they readily available? Was someone carving them in Philadelphia?
I think there must have been someone. I mean, I'm less familiar with the frame makers in Philadelphia, but certainly there were enough cabinet makers with the skill to create frames like that by the 1770s. Because I know in Boston, for example, there are several portraits by like John Singleton Copley with quite elaborately carved frames, and those are being produced locally. So there's definitely cabinet makers in the area who would have had the skill to do that if that's what they wanted. And I know I've seen a few well-known well-known Philadelphia families with elaborate frames. I can't remember what the Cadwallader ones look like, but there are other examples. But then there's a number of Quaker families who have much more simplified portraits from Philadelphia, which again just speaks to sort of wanting a more modest presentation of their portrait.
The great Franklin frame in the world is now at the Metropolitan Museum of the French portrait, the man portrait with his, where he literally has the pelt of the British lion hanging out of the frame in this elaborate carving. Probably shouldn't say that in an English program. We may be being monitored. I'll start tracking down my ancestry of attempted regicides, and we'll get banned from the air. Or I don't know, are we on the air with Zoom? Have we more questions from our wonderful audience? One of the problems of Zoom is the questions are coming in 6-point type for a man with progressive bifocal.
Well, we do have Carrie Deanhorn just chimed in to point out that the type of frame would be related to when it was made, which is very true. So like the Rococo of the colonial era would be very different from the neoclassical by the 1790s. So depending on when these different portraits were framed or when he was painted, the frames would have changed. So that's true.
I'm embarrassed to say the history of frames is not in my wheelhouse, although I once sat next to a frame historian at a conference in London and was fascinated that could be a research subject. But who knew? it's been wonderful getting to meet you again. If too far away, I don't think I'll get to the northern Midwest, either in Philadelphia or in London soon. I know your research before the APS was on portraits in the colonial American South. Are you returning to that project now, or?
Yeah, well, I never quite gave it up. I've got a couple of articles sort of in the works or under review that I'm hoping to publish. So yeah, most of my scholarship that I'm writing about focuses on especially colonial Virginia portraiture and the ways colonists use portraiture. So
you've got a dissertation director back there who's nagging you to turn it into a book at some point. So
yes,
so you don't need me to do. Well, we're almost I think we are out of time. I'll give my traditional plug at the end of these, that I thank you all for joining us here on Craven Street. As you leave, Trafalgar Square is to your right. Just walk up the hill beyond the Boots chemists, and there's also a nice bookshop and a Pret sandwich shop nearby. Or you can turn left, go half a street, and turn left again, and we'll meet at the Ship and Shovel for drinks in a few minutes. Although I have to say, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Philadelphia, it's a bit early even for me to have a pint of cider. But I certainly wish we could. And I'd plead with you all, if you're not currently a member of the Friends of Franklin House, please join. It's a wonderful historic site that, like every house museum in the world right now, has had to close. And so it's a great time to send your donations in. And we will gather next. If you are not on the mailing list, please get so. My dear friend Carrie Dethorne, Chief Curator of the Independence National Historical Park here in Philadelphia, will do a further program on Charles Willson Peale. You'll get a little more deep into his bio and his kids, and literally into the rooms where it happened with Peale. If you don't know him, he was a temporary Londoner, like a lot of our characters in this series. But please be in touch. If you want to be in touch with me, my very simple email is gwbphd@hotmail.com, or my website is gwbphd.com. Would love to hear if you're enjoying the programs and if you have any ideas about what else we can do. And I look forward to seeing you all next month, when I hope it's a little cooler than it is today. And again, Dr. Janine Yorimoto Boldt, wonderful work, really exciting. I may nag you to turn this into an article sometime soon. So thank you all very much. Peace be with thee.
thank you, everyone.